So I knew this young man who was going to do his freshman year at St. Olaf's College. Now, I think that's in Minnesota. Yeah, you betcha. And so he was there for a month or two and decided it wasn't for him. Got homesick, came back to Seattle. So a little bit later, his grandpa calls the boy's mother and says, so how's Danny doing at St. Olaf's? Yeah, you betcha. And his mother says, well, he got homesick and he come home, you betcha. And his grandpa says, he got homesick, he came home. Why in hell would how you felt about something affect a decision such as going to college? And the boy's mother was telling me this story, and she said, you know, it took me a lot of years of therapy to overcome that way of thinking and looking at the world. And I thought, yeah, you bet it would. You'd want to get free of that kind of don't let your feelings affect anything. And then one day I read about this couple that just thought it would be wonderfully romantic to rent an island on somewhere off of Vancouver Island, a small island, and it had one cabin on the island, and they were going to be locked in all winter, I suppose, until somebody could come and get them in the springtime. And they just thought that'd be wonderfully romantic. Well, they began to argue in December, and they got nasty. And then in January, they just started screaming at each other. And along about the 1st of February, he found himself sitting on her chest with his hand cocked back to just shut her up. And he thought, you know, if I hit her, I'm going to kill her. So he got off of her and he drew a chalk line down the middle of the cabin, and they hung up a rope and some sheets to divide the cabin so they didn't have to look at each other. And they divided the books and did not speak to each other until springtime, when they were able to get off the island and got a divorce. Now, if you happen to know where I could find that story, I'd appreciate hearing about it. At any rate, I thought about, you know, Norwegian couples had to live in little tiny cabins separated from their neighbors all winter long, you know, cooped up in a little cabin, and somehow managed to make it through the winter without killing each other, without having to go to the extremes that this couple in Vancouver did, Vancouver Island. And so what that would take would be, you do not acknowledge your feelings. You don't let your feelings affect your actions. My probably third, maybe fourth great grandfather, Jacob Kirk, had a team of 12 oxen. And he went to Jefferson County, Iowa, with his oxen to break the sod. He couldn't do it with horses. There were no horses strong enough to pull a plow and break that sod. You had to have oxen. And they had the worst winter on record, and he had to choose 6 of his 12 and bring them down into the sod hut with his wife and 2 or 3 kids. And the other 6 oxen had to freeze to death. Now, what would it take? What would you need to do as the wife? Do not stick a knife in your husband and shoo those oxen back out the door. And if, as the husband, what would you have to do to not pound on your wife as she whines and cries about, you know, God damn it, how do I keep these little children out from underneath these oxen? And how do we get any sleep? How do we get any rest with 6 oxen in a sod hut? Okay, so in contrast to this, the other night I had the interesting experience of going to a weekly group meeting sponsored by what's called the Mankind Project. And at first I got kind of annoyed at how formalized the evening was. Several rituals having to, having a basis in American Indian folklore. And then the whole evening was just a series of rituals or formalized processes. We will talk about this and only this, and we don't respond to each other. Each person just delivers their own experience, their own truth, and go around the circle. And at first I found it annoying, and then I realized, God, you know what? Most of the time, most men are talking about women and who's up and who's down, who's good looking, who ain't. And among men, among the men, who's up and who's down. And they're talking about Fords and Chevys and the Broncos and the Lakers. And maybe if it's safe enough, they'll talk about some politics. But men do not talk about what they're worried about, what they're afraid of, who humiliated them recently and how it was they were humiliated. And so my appreciation of this formalized structure went up tremendously. So there you have a juxtaposition of what it takes to live in a tiny cabin and not kill each other versus how men might change how they interact with each other and how they might relate to each other. Sure would like to hear who is out there listening to this stuff. Do you know that thing I did about race and sex? 175 views. They say sex sells. I'll tell you, it must, because I ain't got 175 friends. And then that thing about mind body, that got like 50 views. Pretty amazing. I sure would like to know, who the hell are you?